December 24th, 1944, somewhere near the German border. The wind carried ice that night, the kind that stings the skin and turns breath into fog. Inside a makeshift compound of barbed wire and wooden barracks, silence clung to everything. The war had ground to a halt here, not from peace, but from exhaustion. American soldiers, weary and unshaven, gathered around a small lantern in the snow. Their rations were thin, their faces hollow. Yet, as the hour neared midnight, someone, a chaplain's assistant, began to hum. Slowly others joined in. Silent night, holy night. The melody drifted over the fence, carried by the cold air. On the other side, in another enclosure, a separate camp of female prisoners and displaced civilians, the sound reached them. Women wrapped in blankets lifted their heads. Some recognized the tune instantly. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Their eyes filled with tears. For a brief moment, the guns, the wire, and the war itself seemed to disappear. Only the song remained, fragile, human, and eternal. That night, amid the snow and ruin, faith whispered louder than fear. Europe. Winter 1944. The war had entered its fifth frozen season. The once invincible Reich was collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. Cities lay in ashes. Railways were crippled. Civilians fled burning towns with carts and blankets, while armies moved through a wasteland of ice and silence. In the West, Hitler's last gamble, the Ardennes offensive, was unfolding. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted in mid-December, throwing the American front into chaos. Entire divisions were cut off, surrounded by snow and steel. Forests that once echoed with birds now thundered with artillery. The sky, when not gray with clouds, burned with tracer fire. But away from the front lines, another kind of suffering spread quietly, one without headlines or glory. Scattered across Belgium, France, and Western Germany were hundreds of transit camps, POW enclosures, and refugee compounds hastily constructed from timber and barbed wire. Inside them lived the broken remnants of war, captured soldiers, displaced families, and women uprooted by invasion and retreat. Many of these women had once worked in occupied cities or served as forced labor under the Nazi regime. Others were Red Cross nurses, clerks, or civilians caught between shifting front lines. Some had been arrested for sheltering Allied pilots, others for simply being in the wrong place when the wrong flag rose over their town. By December, food in these camps had become scarce. The winter was one of the coldest in memory. Temperatures in the Ardennes plunged below 10 to 26 Celsius. Blankets were thin, shoes worn through, and diseases like frostbite and dysentery spread easily. Prisoners burned scraps of wood, sometimes even parts of the barracks, just to keep their hands alive. From the guards' watchtowers, the world looked quiet, but beneath that stillness was exhaustion, a kind of shared numbness that neither side could escape. German sentries shivered beside their rifles. American POWs huddled together for warmth, their breath steaming in the moonlight. The women in the adjoining enclosures, most of them civilians, whispered prayers for mourning. For the prisoners, Christmas was no longer a celebration, only a date. Yet for many, faith still lingered, fragile as a flame. The few who owned Bibles or hymn sheets kept them close, their pages worn thin from being passed around in secret. Even the guards, hardened by propaganda and fatigue, sometimes paused to listen when someone dared to sing. And so, across a continent suffocating in smoke and ice, a strange quiet fell as Christmas approached. The guns never fully stopped, but their rhythm slowed. Soldiers and prisoners alike could sense something. Not peace, but a pause. The kind of silence that made men think of home. It was in this uneasy stillness, amid hunger, wire, and snow, that an old song would travel farther than bullets. Across the Western Front, the American Army faced a different kind of enemy that winter, not just German divisions, but isolation, exhaustion, and the creeping cold. By December 1944, many U.S. units had been in the field for months without rest. Letters from home arrived late or not at all. Rations froze before they could be eaten. Even the strongest men began to show cracks. A quiet fatigue that went beyond the body. Yet, through that numbness, one ritual survived. Music. In foxholes, chapels, and makeshift tents, American soldiers sang. Not for performance, but for remembrance. Songs like "I'll Be Home for Christmas," "White Christmas," and "Silent Night" drifted through the European winter, sometimes faintly heard by both friend and foe. To those who sang, the words were more than melody. They were connection, a fragile bridge to families thousands of miles away. The U.S. Army Chaplain Corps played a central role in keeping that spirit alive. Chaplains, both Catholic and Protestant, carried hymn books and small organs to the front. They organized Christmas services under shell fire, often with nothing but a lantern and a Bible. In some units, GIs formed small choirs, groups of men who could harmonize despite hunger and frostbite. At rear bases and temporary camps, these choirs became a symbol of morale. Field commanders encouraged them to sing for the wounded, the captured, and the displaced. The Red Cross supported such efforts, seeing music as both therapy and diplomacy, a sound of civilization amid barbarity. One of those choirs, composed of ordinary infantrymen and a chaplain from Pennsylvania, found itself stationed near a makeshift camp that December. Beyond their wire fence was another enclosure, holding women from across Europe. French resistance workers, Polish civilians, and captured German Red Cross volunteers. They could not see each other clearly, but at night, their voices carried across the snow. That particular camp, like many in the rear zones of the Ardennes front, was temporary, built from lumber, and surrounded by barbed wire. Inside, the Americans had little more than field stoves and tin cups. Yet, in a gesture of defiance against the war's inhumanity, they decided to hold a midnight service on Christmas Eve. The chaplain suggested one hymn that everyone knew, even the enemy. He said quietly, "Let's sing something the whole world remembers." Silent Night had been written in Austria in 1818 by Joseph Mohr and Franz Gruber. Its melody, simple and haunting, had survived empires and revolutions. During the First World War, it was sung across no man's land during the unofficial Christmas truce of 1914, a brief moment when opposing soldiers laid down their rifles and exchanged small gifts. 3 decades later, that same song returned to another generation of men buried in snow and disbelief. But now, its audience would be more unexpected. Women prisoners huddled in silence, separated by wire and fear. The Americans did not know who listened that night. They sang for themselves, for home, for survival. But on the other side of the camp, women from nations divided by the war lifted their heads toward the sound. It was not victory they heard, but something older, something deeper. As the last note faded into the cold, the moment lingered, fragile as breath. And from that shared silence would emerge a story that survived long after the smoke of battle cleared. By December 1944, humanity had nearly vanished from the war's vocabulary. Every side spoke in terms of victory or annihilation. Yet within the wire of those camps, the grand strategies of generals meant little. Hunger, frost, and memory ruled instead. When the first lines of Silent Night floated through the cold air, something stirred in the people listening. Not patriotism, but recognition. The women in the adjacent enclosure, many of them Germans, Poles, and Belgians, had not heard a song since their capture. For months, they had lived by ration calls, guard whistles, and the metallic clank of the gate. To hear human voices lifted in harmony felt almost unreal. Eyewitnesses from other camps later recalled similar moments. A lullaby sung, a carol hummed, a reminder that not all sound meant danger. In the American choir's song, those women heard a reflection of themselves, longing for home, for family, for a world where snow meant winter, not war. The men who sang were no less changed. In their music, they rediscovered fragments of their humanity, the part that the mud, the fear, and the endless killing had tried to erase. Many would later say that Christmas Eve was the first night they remembered they were still men, not just soldiers. For both sides, it was not peace, but a pause, one that made the silence afterward almost unbearable. Silent Night was one of the few songs that belonged to everyone. It was written in German, sung in English, translated into more than 100 languages before 1940. Soldiers carried it in hymn books. Mothers taught it to children. Churches echoed it every winter across continents. By the time of World War II, it had become a paradox, a song of peace sung by armies at war. The melody's calm simplicity defied the chaos surrounding it. To German listeners, it evoked home and faith. To the Americans, it spoke of hope and duty. Its universal familiarity gave it a strange power in captivity. Even those who could not understand the words recognized the tune. It bridged languages and front lines, a musical truce in miniature. There are recorded instances of Allied and Axis troops singing it across opposing lines, from Italy in 1943 to Belgium in 1944. American chaplains noted that, when Silent Night began, even the guards often grew still. The song had transcended propaganda. It had become untouchable, sacred in its simplicity. That night, when the American choir began to sing it, they unknowingly reached across cultural and ideological boundaries. In the women's camp, German lips quietly joined in, some mouthing the German words, others only humming. It was not defiance. It was memory, the only form of freedom left to them. For a few minutes, the war's languages spoke one voice. Life inside the camps was not defined only by physical deprivation, but by the slow erosion of self. Prisoners lived by orders and routines, stripped of purpose. Hope was a dangerous thing. It could make men reckless or break them entirely when crushed. But rituals, even small ones, could anchor the mind. In POW and refugee camps, chaplains and prisoners clung to faith as a survival tool. Lighting a candle, saying a prayer, humming a carol. Each was an act of quiet rebellion against despair. Psychologists who later studied post-war testimonies found that music and shared worship had measurable effects on morale. It restored identity in environments designed to erase it. Singing was not escape. It was endurance. When the American choir began Silent Night, they were doing more than performing a hymn. They were reminding themselves of who they were, sons, fathers, believers, people still capable of grace. For the women who listened, it triggered an emotional collapse long held at bay. Tears came not from sadness, but from recognition that humanity, though distant, still existed. Many would later recall it as the first time they cried without fear of punishment. In a world where even compassion was rationed, that song became an act of psychological resistance. In every war, there are leaders who command armies, and others who command the soul. During World War II, U.S. Army chaplains were among the latter. They carried no weapons, yet were present on nearly every battlefield. Their role was not to win ground, but to hold hearts together. That winter, in the Ardennes, chaplains faced a crisis unlike any before. The American line was collapsing under the German counteroffensive. Supplies were running out, the wounded filled every shelter, and morale trembled. Yet, in that darkness, chaplains improvised, turning tents into chapels and campfires into altars. The chaplain who led the choir that night understood the quiet power of faith. He knew that words of Scripture might fail to reach frozen hearts, but a song could. Silent Night was chosen not to convert or preach, but to unify. It was something every soldier, regardless of faith, could recognize. He also knew the risk. Singing too loudly might alert German patrols nearby. Lights could draw sniper fire. Yet he gave the order softly. Let them sing. Leadership, in that moment, meant defying the logic of war, replacing fear with harmony. In a world where officers measured progress in miles and casualties, the chaplain measured it in decency. His choice turned a patch of frozen earth into something sacred. When historians later analyzed the morale of Allied forces in winter 1944, they noted that chaplain services often prevented despair in isolated units. In the choir's song that night, leadership took its purest form, guiding men not toward battle, but toward humanity. On the other side of the wire stood the guards, young German soldiers, conscripts from shattered units sent to oversee prisoners. Many were barely 20 years old, drafted after losing brothers or fathers on the Eastern Front. By 1944, they no longer believed in Hitler's victory. They believed in surviving winter. That Christmas Eve, they paced their watchtowers in silence. The snow deadened sound, and visibility was poor. But then came something unexpected. Voices, male, distant, singing softly through the cold. The guards turned toward the sound instinctively. For a moment, they could not tell whether it was German or English. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Some of them knew the words by heart. They had sung it as children, standing beside parents now long lost to war. Against every rule, one guard lowered his rifle. Another removed his cap. There are accounts, scattered, uncertain, of German sentries that night humming along quietly, too softly for anyone to notice. Inside the women's compound, their prisoners wept. The guards said nothing. Perhaps they understood. Or perhaps, like everyone else that winter, they were too tired to enforce cruelty. The historian in hindsight can only guess what passed through their minds. But in that frozen silence, the hierarchy of war dissolved for a few minutes. The captor and the captured listened to the same song. And for once, there was no difference between them. War strips people of names, replacing them with numbers, ranks, or categories. Enemy, prisoner, guard. Yet beneath those words, the human heart continues to beat, stubbornly refusing to obey ideology. That night's music was a moral rebellion, not political, but profoundly human. The soldiers who sang had nothing to gain. The women who cried had nothing to offer. But in those few minutes, both sides rediscovered what war had tried to erase: empathy. Moral courage in wartime rarely appears heroic. It is not the charge across open ground, but the refusal to let hatred become normal. The American choir did not set out to make peace. They simply remembered decency. And in doing so, they offered something far rarer than victory: grace. Decades later, survivors of various camps, women who endured captivity under both Axis and Allied hands, would recall moments of compassion like this with the same trembling voice: a guard sharing bread, a prisoner covering another with a blanket, a song carried through the wire. Such acts did not end the war, but they proved that even in total darkness, moral light survived. The echo of that song lingered long after the voices faded, carried not by radios or records, but by memory. A memory that would resurface in testimonies, diaries, and the quiet tears of those who lived to remember. Christmas Eve, 1944, somewhere between the snow-covered pines of the Western Front. The night had gone silent long before the first note was sung. Snow drifted in steady curtains, muting every sound except the wind's low sigh through the wire. A dull orange glow flickered from a makeshift fire in a steel drum, its smoke curling into the frozen air. Around it huddled a dozen American soldiers, their faces shadowed and weary. A few yards away, the camp's chaplain stood with his gloves off, thumbing the pages of a worn hymnal. He looked at his men, their helmets resting beside them, rifles stacked in silence. Beyond the wire, he could see the faint outlines of another enclosure. Darker, stiller. The women's camp. He'd heard whispers about it from guards and Red Cross staff, displaced civilians, nurses, widows, and refugees waiting for transport. The chaplain raised his head. "Let's begin quietly," he said. "No instruments, no accompaniment, only voices." A soft baritone began, "Silent night, holy night." Then another joined, and another. Within moments, harmony filled the freezing air, fragile but clear. The snow caught the sound and scattered it, carrying it beyond the fence, across the camp, into the night. Inside the women's enclosure, the first reaction was disbelief. A few lifted their heads from their blankets, straining to listen. Then realization. It was a song. A Christmas song. Some had not heard music in months. For others, it had been years. One woman, a Polish nurse, pressed her hands to her mouth and began to tremble. Another, once a schoolteacher from Cologne, whispered the words in German, almost afraid of being heard. "Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht." The melody swelled, American voices singing the same tune that had been born in Austria more than a century earlier, now rising again through the barbed wire of a German winter. Even the guards stopped moving. One leaned on his rifle, his breath visible in the cold, his eyes fixed on the snow. Another, standing watch above the gate, lowered his flashlight. No orders came. No one spoke. The song's verses rolled gently through the dark. All is calm, all is bright. The women began to weep openly now, not out of sorrow, but from the shock of hearing something unbroken. Tears left faint trails down faces chapped and pale from frost. One knelt in the snow, clutching a piece of cloth, the only remnant of home she still possessed. The chaplain's voice grew softer with each line. His men sang as if afraid to disturb the stillness around them. In those few minutes, the sound of war, the mortars, the boots, the orders, vanished entirely. In its place stood something neither side could name, an understanding that went deeper than language. When the last line faded, the world seemed to hold its breath. Snow continued to fall, gently covering footprints and ashes alike, and from the other side of the wire came a response. Faint, hesitant, but unmistakable. Women's voices. They were singing, too. At first, it was almost impossible to tell if the echo was real. The men stopped singing. The sound lingered. Soft, trembling, unmistakably human. Then it became clear. Across the wire, from the dark cluster of barracks, came voices. Higher, thinner, fragile with cold and hunger. The women were singing back, "Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht." The German words carried easily through the frozen air. The tones were uneven, some broken by sobs, others barely whispers. But they were singing. The Americans stood motionless, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the fence. No one spoke. No one dared. For the chaplain, it felt like a miracle. not in the sense of divine spectacle, but of impossible grace. Two groups who had never met, separated by barbed wire and war, were joined by the same melody that once calmed Europe a generation earlier. The soldiers lowered their heads. Some crossed themselves, others simply listened. The sound of the women's singing filled the camp like candlelight, faint but warm. One of the guards on the women's side, a conscript from Hamburg, barely 19, later told an interrogator that he had never seen anything like it. They sang together, he said, and for a little while it was as if the war stopped breathing. The two groups took turns softly completing verses, sometimes overlapping, the English and German words blending into one language of hope. Sleep in heavenly peace. Schlafly in himmlichere. It was no truce. There were no handshakes, no ceasefire, only sound and silence between. Yet that silence was more powerful than any treaty. For several minutes after the final note faded, nobody moved. The fire burned low, the snow continued to fall, and even the guards, usually so rigid, stood with their rifles lowered, eyes lost in thought. A witness from the American side, a medic named Thomas Avery, later wrote in his diary, "For once, the fence didn't matter. We couldn't see their faces, but we could feel them there. It was the same song our mothers sang, and for a few minutes, it was Christmas again." Some of the women knelt in the snow long after the sound had gone. Others pressed their hands against the wire, leaving faint traces of warmth that froze moments later. A few whispered prayers, their tears freezing on their cheeks. When the guards finally gave the order for lights out, no one protested. The men retreated to their barracks quietly, still hearing the echo of that shared hymn in their heads. The women, back in their bunks, clung to the memory as if it were a relic, proof that somewhere beyond the chaos, the world still contained beauty. That night, the guns in the nearby valley remained silent. Whether by coincidence or by silent agreement, no artillery was fired for several hours. Even nature seemed to listen. It was only the next morning, when orders resumed, when rations were distributed, and when the machinery of war began to grind once more, that the moment dissolved into history. But for those who were there, it never truly ended. The song had carved itself into their memory, like a scar made of light. Years later, when veterans and survivors spoke of that winter, many would forget dates, ranks, or numbers. But when asked about the night of the song, their eyes changed. They would pause, smile faintly, and say, "Yes, I remember that night." The wire was still there. The war raged on, but humanity had broken through, quietly, without orders, without permission, and that fragile echo of silent night would outlast every gun that tried to drown it. When dawn came, it did not feel like Christmas morning, only another day of war. The snow had stopped, leaving the camp draped in silence and ash-gravy light. Smoke rose faintly from the burned barrel, the only trace of the night before. The Americans woke early to the sound of trucks in the distance. Supply convoys, perhaps. Orders crackled over radios. The war, relentless and mechanical, resumed its rhythm. Yet something lingered in the air. A strange calm, a gentleness that refused to fade. The chaplain conducted a short morning service. Few spoke. Most only listened. When he mentioned the word peace, heads bowed instinctively. There was no applause, no hymn, just quiet. But every man there remembered what had happened the night before. The sound that had carried through the wire, the women's fragile voices rising from the dark. Later that day, the chaplain wrote a brief report for the Red Cross field office assisting the camp. It was a simple note, one paragraph long. Christmas Eve. Choir sang Silent Night. Women prisoners joined in from across the wire. No incidents, no disturbance, only silence afterward. That single line would later be found among hundreds of documents, a minor entry buried in war archives. Yet, Behind its simplicity lay one of the most human moments of the entire conflict. In the women's compound, life returned to its grim rhythm. The guards resumed inspections. Food remained scarce, but the atmosphere had shifted. Some women whispered about the American song, as if afraid it might vanish if spoken too loudly. A Polish nurse who survived the war later recalled, "We were no longer just prisoners. For one night, someone remembered we were people." She would go on to work for the Red Cross after liberation, often singing Silent Night during Christmas services in refugee hospitals. Among the American soldiers, memories of that night followed them home. When interviewed decades later for oral history projects, several veterans spoke of it with the same reverence they reserved for major battles. One said simply, "It was the only time during the war that I didn't feel like I was fighting someone." Officially, the event never made headlines. The front lines were collapsing, and the Battle of the Bulge dominated every newspaper. But within letters, journals, and whispered recollections, the story persisted. Proof that even amid chaos, decency had survived. As the weeks passed, the war's tide turned sharply. The Allies pushed deeper into German territory. Camps were moved, prisoners relocated, some never to see each other again. Yet that night's song, carried by memory, endured. When the U.S. Army and Red Cross later gathered testimonies for post-war morale studies, moments of shared faith and song appeared again and again. They were small, almost invisible gestures, but together they revealed a truth military statistics could not measure. That kindness, though buried, had not died. And in that winter of 1944-45, when the world seemed beyond redemption, one song had reminded a handful of people that peace was still imaginable. But the war would not end easily. The months ahead would bring firestorms, camps liberated, and entire cities in ruin. Yet, among all those reports of destruction, the memory of that night, the night of Silent Night, continued to surface, like a flicker of light refusing to go out. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the world emerged from its longest night. Cities lay in ruins, rail lines twisted in heaps of metal. Millions were displaced, scattered across a continent that no longer recognized itself. Yet, amid that wreckage, stories like the Christmas Eve choir began to surface. Faint, but enduring. For many survivors, recounting those moments became a form of resistance against despair. Red Cross volunteers, chaplains, and nurses spoke of small acts that defied the brutality of war, of soldiers sharing food, of doctors tending enemy wounded, of songs that crossed fences. Silent Night became more than a hymn. It became a bridge between languages, a fragile proof that compassion had not vanished completely. In 1946, a former American chaplain, believed to be the same man who had led the choir, returned to Europe under the U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division. He visited former camps being converted into refugee centers. In one report, he wrote, "Some of the women recognized me. They remembered the song. One of them wept when she heard it again. She said it made her believe the world could begin anew." That encounter, noted in the archives of the U.S. Army Chaplain Corps, shows how deeply such moments could shape reconciliation. They were not grand treaties or political decrees. They were human memories, shared by people who had once stood on opposite sides of the wire. By the early 1950s, the story had quietly entered church sermons and humanitarian newsletters. Red Cross publications in Switzerland and Germany referenced an incident during Christmas 1944, where prisoners and Allied soldiers sang together across barbed wire. The names were never included, perhaps lost or deliberately omitted, but the account was preserved. In post-war Germany, The song Stille Nacht took on an even heavier meaning. For many, it became a hymn of mourning rather than celebration. Yet, within that sorrow, the memory of that night near the border symbolized something else. Reconciliation without words. A moment where humanity had momentarily reclaimed its voice. American veterans who later visited Germany under friendship, and veterans' exchange programs often sought out the places where such stories had occurred. Some brought gifts, hymnals, Bibles, or simply their presence. They found that many of the former prisoners had gone on to rebuild lives as teachers, nurses, and aid workers. One German woman, interviewed by a BBC correspondent in 1958, said softly, "When I hear that song, I don't think of war. I think of a night when enemies remembered they were the same." In the decades that followed, historians and filmmakers pieced together fragments of this forgotten event. It appeared briefly in a Red Cross exhibition in Geneva in 1984, labeled only Christmas 1944, Joint Choir Across the Wire. No photographs existed, no recordings survived, only memory. And yet, that was enough. In an era when nations sought to rebuild not just cities but consciences, stories like this offered something indispensable: evidence that mercy could exist even in a world designed for cruelty. By the time the veterans and survivors who lived that night began to fade away, their recollections had already done their quiet work. They had entered the bloodstream of collective memory, not through medals or monuments, but through the endurance of a single song. When later generations visited war memorials, they often encountered that same melody, played softly during December ceremonies. Few knew its full story, but somewhere behind those notes lay the faint echo of that frozen night, when women behind barbed wire cried as Americans sang Silent Night. History often remembers the noise of war, the thunder of artillery, the crash of tanks, the roar of engines pushing through mud. But its deepest truths often live in silence. On that frozen night in 1944, there were no speeches, no declarations. Only a song, a hymn sung by men in uniform and answered by women behind barbed wire. It lasted only minutes, then vanished into the cold. Yet somehow, that moment outlived the war itself. Silent Night was written in another age of conflict, meant to bring comfort amid fear. But on that battlefield, it became something else: a bridge across hatred, a pause in history when the human spirit refused to surrender. Those who survived never called it a miracle. They spoke of it quietly, as if afraid to disturb its fragility. To them, it was proof that goodness had not been erased, that even in a world engineered for destruction, compassion could still break through the cracks. Every war leaves behind ruins, cities, graves, and memories that haunt generations. But it also leaves behind fragments of grace, scattered like embers. Sometimes, those embers are all that remain to remind us who we are. The women who cried that night were not celebrating victory. They were mourning the world they had lost, and, perhaps, glimpsing the one that might return. The soldiers who sang were not heroes that night, only men trying to remember peace. And that is why the story endures. Because in that fleeting harmony, between captors and captives, between language and silence, humanity reintroduced itself to itself. As the decades pass and the witnesses fade, the snow still falls over Europe each December. Somewhere, Silent Night plays again, echoing faintly through the years. Not as a song of triumph, but as a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, there was still light.